I teach philosophy at LaSalle University in Philadelphia, PA, in the United States. And I'm going to be going over how to write a great paper for the John Locke essay contest for 2023. And I'm just going to go over the philosophy categories. There are a couple of categories that the Locke contest offers, but my background is philosophy. I have a PhD in philosophy and I teach philosophy. So that's usually the category that I help people with, even though there are other categories that are similar to philosophy. But we can start just by looking at the broad requirements of the contest and how the organizers describe the contest, because it's always important to meet the criteria that the organizers establish for the submissions and papers, right? So if we look at the 2023 essay competition website, there we can see that we're told that the John Locke Institute encourages young people to cultivate the characteristics that turn good students into great writers. Independent thought, these are important, right? Because this is what they want to see in the paper. Independent thought, depth of knowledge, clear reasoning, critical analysis, and persuasive style. So these are the main criteria that they're looking for to judge the papers. They continued by saying that our essay competition invites students to explore a wide range of challenging and interesting questions beyond the confines of the school curriculum. Okay, so that's important. That's important to keep in mind because they're looking for creative entries, right, that go beyond just what you would learn at in a high school curriculum, right? Or even maybe freshman college curriculum. Who knows what they're looking for? But they add the judges will choose their favorite essay from each of 7 subject categories and a junior category for under 15, and then select an overall best essay across the 7 subjects. And so the 7 subjects are philosophy, politics, economics, history, psychology, theology, and law. But like I said, I'm going to be only talking about the philosophy category. But the good news is that given the criteria that the Locke contest is asking for, independent thought, depth of knowledge, clear reasoning, critical analysis, these are all hallmarks of philosophy, right? This is what philosophers try to do. They try to think independently, they try to think deeply, they put reasoning forward for the positions that they hold, and they use critical analysis, right, to establish their position. So philosophy is a good subject to choose if you're going to submit an essay to the Locke contest. Never mind the fact that John Locke himself was a philosopher. That also helps you, right? The essay contest is named after a philosopher. Well, Locke was also a doctor, but I mean, he's known today as a philosopher. Philosophy of mind and political philosophy being his areas of speciality, right? Okay, so you can get more information about the criteria they want from the website. I put the website address in here, and I'll post, if I can leave my PowerPoint, or you can email me after the contest. My email is available, so if you email me, I can send you this PowerPoint. But the submission deadline this year is always important to remember the deadline. The deadline this year is June the 30th, right? But they've actually changed the contest a little bit. They used to just accept submissions just before the deadline, but this year is a little bit different. I was looking into the website and they have new entry requirements. I just want to make sure you guys know this, that you have to register before you submit this year. And so registration opens on April 1st. So you have a little bit of time, but not that much time, right? Because I mean, we're already at the end of March practically, but you have a little bit of time because registration opens April 1st and ends May 31st. So you have until May 31st before 11:59, that's British time, to register. Then in order to register, you're going to need an active email address. They're going to probably contact you to confirm the registration. And if you don't register by the deadline, they will not accept your paper. So you do have to make sure you register. And then basically after that, after you register, make sure that your submission is entered before 11:59 p.m. on Friday, June 30th. And always, this is Greenwich Mean Time, British Standard Time, right? 11:59 British Standard Time. So, and then the conditions for age are you have to be 18 years or younger on the date of the submission. Okay, so if you're if you turn 19 on, June, in July 1st, you're still good. You're okay. But uh, if you turn 19 on June 30th, you cannot submit. So there's also a junior prize for students 14 years and younger. Who, yeah, again, you have to be 14 or younger on June 30th, 2023. Okay, so like I said, well, entry is free, so that hasn't changed. Essays have to address one of the questions in the subject category that they gave, those 7 subject categories. The length is 2,000 words, but you can actually write a lot more than that because the 2,000 words does not count footnotes or bibliography. And later on, I'll show you some sample essays, winning essays from previous years. I have a few saved. And you'll see that the average length was probably 4, even 5,000 words, because a lot of information was put into footnotes, and bibliographies usually are really long because you have to demonstrate depth of knowledge. The best way to demonstrate depth of knowledge is to show that you've looked at a lot of work in the field, right? A lot of journal articles and books and essays, etc. They also want your submission as a PDF this year, and the PDF has to be in the format that you put your last name, first name, last name, category, question. I think I did this wrong, so it should be Blaze to Zone, but I thought it was last name, first name. But anyway, so you can look up the website again. The address for the website, John Locke Institute, it has this information. Look for it because it's important. And for this year, you have to provide an email address of an academic referee. This is also new. They did not do this last year. So you can provide the email of your teacher. You can provide the email of someone who's familiar with your written work. It can be a tutor. It can be, a teacher who you had in the past. And the institute is going to email the person whose name you give. So they're going to email, this is going to be a referee. The referee's job is to confirm that the essay is original. I don't know why they made these changes. Maybe because people are using Chat GPT. I really don't know. I couldn't tell you. But again, the link to find out more information about that is John Locke Institute Essay Competition. Okay, so let's get into this because right, like I said, John Locke, the British Enlightenment philosopher, Oxford academic, medical doctor. The essay contest is named after Locke. In the spirit of Locke's main interest, we can look at the categories for philosophy. Locke was a philosopher. He's best known today for his work in epistemology and political philosophy. We're going to look at the categories that they're asking. Actually, they do cover some epistemology this year, and they cover political philosophy. So Locke's interests are well represented. The questions for this year are 3. The 3 questions are, first, a team of scientists wants to discover how many genders there are. How should they proceed? That's the first question. Okay, so that deals mainly with biology, but in terms of philosophy, it's looking at the field of epistemology, right? How do we know? How do we discover something? We'll go back. I'll go back to that. I'll give you some, an overview of what kinds of information you should be providing to answer that well. Question number 2 is, in what sense are you the same person today that you were when you were 10 years old? Okay, so they're looking at a sense of self there. How do we understand ourselves as identical people over time, right? So that's an interesting question. And the third question is tax theft. Okay, that sounds more like a question for economics or politics or both, but you could argue that it actually deals with ethics. And so ethics is a sub-discipline of philosophy. So these are all philosophy questions. And in fact, philosophy, there's only, questions, let's look at how the questions are organized, and then we can see philosophical elements in these questions. Because when you read it the first time, you might think, why is that philosophy question? Scientists and that's biology. The second one is maybe psychology, and the third one is politics, right? But actually, they are philosophy questions. If you see how they're organized, as you look at what precisely the questions are asking. Questions 1 and 2 are asking mostly about epistemology, right? Epistemology is one of the 4 sub-disciplines of philosophy, of Western philosophy. Usually philosophers divide their contributions into one of four subdisciplines: epistemology, metaphysics, ethics, and aesthetics. And questions 1 and 2 clearly fall under the category, the subdiscipline of epistemology. Epistemology comes from the Greek term episteme, and that's the Greek word just for knowledge, to know something. How do we know? It's the philosophical term for the study of how we attain knowledge, right? Which is the actual English word is just a joining of two Greek words, the episteme, which means knowledge, and logos, which means a theory or account of something, or a reason for something, right? So how do we know? That's questions 1 and 2. They are asking pretty much about epistemology. How many genders are there? How do we know that there are such and such number of genders, right? And how do you know you are the same person over time? Question number 2 also indirectly involves metaphysics, because it's asking about identity. Metaphysics is another subdiscipline of philosophy, the study of existence, right? First principles, the study of being and the study of existence. It comes from the Greek term ta metaphysica, writings after the physics. It was originally applied to Aristotle's work. The English word derives from the Latin metaphysica, what comes after physics, right? And Aristotle talked about physics, and he said there has to be a prime mover. There has to be a reason for why the natural substances in the universe move the way they do. And he said, but this is beyond physics. And so we get the term metaphysics from that, from the study of existence as a whole, right? All of being. And question number 3 is asking about ethics, another major subdiscipline of philosophy, right? It's dealing with political philosophy. Historically, political philosophy and ethics were basically branches of one another, right? Because ethics, the philosophical study of ethics, this comes from the Greek ethikos, which means custom or acceptable and proper behavior, and even the study of a person's character in a moral sense, right? And so when you think about ethics, you can think about what is right, what is wrong, how should we behave, how should we act? And often that overlaps with politics, because politics is normative. Politics is also about shaping behavior, people's behavior, this time group behavior, but it is a subdiscipline of ethics, right? So this year you can say that the philosophy categories cover several major areas. They're not completely representative of the field. They're ignoring aesthetics this year. In past years, they have asked about aesthetics. That's the last major branch of philosophy. It's completely ignored this time. Aesthetics is basically from the Greek aesthetike. Aesthetike means sensation, how you feel about something, or how you sense the world. In philosophy, it usually designates the study of beauty and art, the philosophy of art. But since they're not covering aesthetics, we're not going to really talk about aesthetics tonight. So I'll focus on the main 2 subdisciplines that they are asking about, which is ethics and epistemology. So if the Locke contest is asking you to write a paper on ethics or epistemology, how can you write a strong paper in those? Okay, well, let's discuss that for a little while, and then we'll get into the individual questions, and I'll go through them one by one. And again, if you have any questions for me, please feel free to write me. I can answer in the chat box, or I can answer directly through the Zoom. Okay, so what do you need to do to write a good philosophy paper? Well, the good news is a lot of the criteria that the Locke contest asks for is also criteria for making a good, strong philosophy paper, right? Because a good philosophy paper has to be argumentative, meaning that you have to take a stand, you have to formulate a thesis or take a position. Okay? Argument doesn't mean you're going to get angry. You're not going to argue with the judges of the Locke contest. You're not going to get upset. You're going to be very rational, but you are going to argue for a position and give reasons for the position. And the best philosophy papers are also clear and systematic. They tend to define their terms. If they introduce new terms, they define them immediately. They explain the positions they're taking. They break down complex problems and analyze. And they usually you're going to take a rational and logical approach to the topic, right? You're going to make your case using evidence. You don't really want to appeal to emotions or rhetoric too much, because philosophy is a rational discipline, right? So you want to actually focus on the structure of arguments, and you want to give reasons for the position you take, and you want your paper to give premises, and from those premises to arrive at conclusions, right? And like I said, I'll show you examples of winning essays from past years' philosophy categories and you can see yourself how those papers arranged their thesis and how they argued from the thesis, how they defended the thesis and argued from premises that they gave to arrive at certain conclusions, right? So those are the three most important criteria, and those are also criteria that the Locke contest asks you to use for all of their categories, right? So you also want to collect evidence, right? Because they do ask for depth of knowledge. That's one of the points that they evaluate. So, in philosophy, you can gather evidence by, going over what previous thinkers, past philosophers have said about a problem, right? But you can also arrive at different conclusions. You can criticize previous answers, and you can come up with original arguments too, although it's not very common. But philosophy is basically a very open-ended discipline. So you can actually analyze problems in a brand new way, right? You can discover things that people have overlooked, or you can criticize things that people have said in the past. But when you do it in a philosophy paper, the important thing is always to provide evidence, right? And show the reader. You show the reader logically why, why tax is theft, right? You don't just say it. You have to show them, because you could say that private property is the basis of a democratic society, and if you take my property without my permission, that's stealing. And when I work, what I earn is mine. And if you take my my wealth without my permission, so you have to give your reason, right? And you can argue from any perspective, any position. You can take a positive position, you can take a negative position, you can even take a more nuanced position, something in the middle. But you always have to argue and logically defend what you say, right? And that's why it's important to define your terms. You don't want to use a term ambiguously, because that weakens your argument. And you want to make sure that you are as clear, you write as clearly as you can, and you give all of your points, you make your points as clearly as possible, because often you're dealing with topics that are very complicated, right? Very complex. So you don't want to add to the complexity by trying to, use very complex technical language that just confuses the reader. You want to be as clear as possible. Write in very clear sentences, one thought per sentence, define your terms, and argue through the paper, right? And it's almost always bad to make assumptions. Right? You don't want to make assumptions. You don't want to assume that your reader believes exactly what you believe. So that's why you want to convince them. That's why you're writing an argumentative paper, right? You may have thought about the problem and come to a conclusion, but just because you believe something is right or true, or that everyone should accept your conclusion, you have to still convince the reader. And to do that, you have to argue, right? And you have to give evidence. And we'll look at how you can give evidence. And how are you going to apply these conditions to this year's essay contest? Well, we'll go through the questions. I'll go through the questions, and I'll give you an idea of how you should answer the three questions that the Locke contest has provided this year. And we'll start with the first one, and we'll go through towards the third one. Okay, so let's take a closer look at the philosophy questions here. Okay, so the first question was that a team of scientists wants to discover how many genders there are. And the question asks you, how should they proceed? Okay, so this kind of question does not really give itself to only a positive or negative thesis. You can't really argue yes or no, right? Because it's asking you about procedural matters, right? And the important keywords here are a group of scientists, and they want to discover. They want to discover a truth about something, right? In this case, a topic that's already complex. It's kind of complex and even controversial, right? Gender is partly connected to biology, but it's also partly connected to cultural expressions and political expressions, right? So we know that. So to write a good philosophy paper on this topic, you'll need to take a position, right? You'll have to say, well, the scientists should do X, Y, Z, but you also have to demonstrate through arguments and logic why your understanding of the material is coherent and insightful. You don't want to leave anything out. You don't want to have a bias, right? You don't want to, for example, assume most people would just say, well, gender is related to biology and there's two genders, male, female, and that's it, end of story. Because you're leaving out, some controversial but important discoveries that there are phenomenon in biology like intersex, and there's also among anthropologists and social scientists, there's a division, between biology and gender, right? And then of course we will ignore gender in linguistics because I don't think that's relevant to this. Obviously they're talking about genders in, the empirical, biological, human, social world, right? We have to assume. So how would you take this position? How would you start this paper? What would you research? Where would you go? Well, it's a question about epistemology, right? So we can start from there. If we're going to answer this as a philosophical question, right? It's asking about how should scientists proceed to categorize gender, right? It's asking about knowledge. How can we know how many genders there are, right? A category, right, is a term that means a class or type of something, a type of being. So a good translation of the question into purely philosophical, epistemological terms might be, can we classify human beings into sexually different kinds, right? Because gender is often connected to sex and expressions of sexual characteristics. So there's obvious epistemological implications there, right? The question is asking, how do we know? How do we know how many genders there are? How do we know what is a gender? And how do we know that someone has a gender or is expressing or identifying with a particular gender, right? How do we know someone is gender? And of course, there's different ways you can answer this. The first step would be to understand the concepts and the terms involved. What does the question mean by discover, right? That could be where you start, right? We know things in different ways. When you know the truth about a mathematical equation, you don't know that the same way that you know that your coffee mug is green, right? Or that I know that my coffee mug is green. It's obviously a different kind of process involved. Both of those facts are known through using concept, because when we think, we use concept, but the way we arrive at the truth conditions for both of those claims is different. Well, what about gender? Like, how do we know about gender? Is it known? Is it known? Basically through the senses, right? Is it known empirically, or do we know gender? Do we understand gender conceptually the way we understand math? Right? That's a good way to start. And most people would probably say it's mostly empirical, right? So discovery there, well, we can go back and analyze that, but I mean, it's a conceptual process that we're dealing with primarily, because discovery deals with an insight into some kind of truth, right? That something can be known and distinguished from other things and therefore classified, right? So if I can know that my coffee cup is green, I've already applied a lot of categories there. I've applied the category that I can identify this as a cup, and this cup is not a pen, right? So already, this is, of course, taken for granted by normal people, but philosophers try not to take anything for granted, right? And then if I've identified this as a cup, then I'm further kind of refining the particular details about the cup when I say it's a green cup. That way I can distinguish it from my white cup that's exactly the same but a different color. I can distinguish it from any red cup. I can distinguish it from, all the other mugs or cups, right? If we go to the Oxford Dictionary, in Standard English, to discover is a verb, right? So it's a kind of activity. So the question is asking about an activity that humans are going to take place in. The meaning of to discover in Standard English is to find something or someone unexpectedly or in the course of a search, right? Okay, so that's important to know, right? They're asking, how can scientists discover how many genders there are? Synonyms for discover include find, locate, come upon, come across, right? So this all kind of reinforces the claim that discovery is an activity, that it's deliberate, that it uncovers something that wasn't really known before, or wasn't known clearly before, or wasn't confirmed before. And in science, because we were told that these are scientists that are trying to discover them. In science, the things that need to be discovered are truths about how the world is, right? At least in empirical science. Most scientists, don't ask, does God exist, before they start studying, gravity. They study the things. They study the things themselves, and they come up with theories to explain it, the things in the world, right? And so the way scientists make discoveries is by empirical research. So to do well on question number one, I think you would have to take a position, and you'd have to have some kind of understanding of the nature of scientific research as empirical, and the kind of truths that can be examined and discovered that way, right? So exploration of the empirical study of sex falls under biology. And that might be a good way to start the research, right? Because even if there is a detachment, even if you can separate gender from, biological sex, most people do kind of recognize that there's some kind of overlap there, right? It's not a coincidence that people who are gendered male usually have XY chromosome, and people who are gendered female have XX chromosome, right? That can't be a complete accident, because it's not, because we know that gender as an expression of sexual characteristics is tied into different hormones that the body produces, and those are determined by your chromosomes. Okay, so a good way to start would be to look at biology, look at sex understood in biology. The concept of gender is, of course, very complex. It's very multifaceted. There's still ongoing debate. This is why this topic is kind of tricky. It's kind of, I don't know. I find this as a controversial subject, right? Because there's still ongoing debate about how to define and understand gender. But what you could do if you really wanted to do well on this topic, I think you could start by just reviewing scientific studies of the concept of gender, right? What do social scientists say about it? What do biologists say about it? Again, probably you can safely ignore linguistics, because they're not asking about gendered language. A lot of languages like German and Italian and French have gendered words. English doesn't have as much gender terms in its language, but some languages, but they're not asking about that, right? So you'd want to collect some papers. You would start by looking for papers that collect empirical data, genetic markers, biological conditions for establishing gender in humans and in animals. You'd probably want to start with that. Now, it's important to remember that these Locke essays have to be very, very brief, right? They give you 2,000 words of text. Okay? You can add footnotes. You can add some of the research you did in footnotes, and it'll probably come to 5,000 words altogether, but that's not a lot. So you have to be very, very careful about, only including really important or essential information, right? So you would want to look up maybe the most widely cited papers by the best scientists about, biological conditions connected to gender, right? Then you could study other factors. You could start by you don't even have to get into detail. You could say that most scientists, or judging by the research literature, many scientists think that there is a connection between biology and gender, and you can make a footnote and give a list of some of the papers you looked at to show the judges that you have a kind of depth of knowledge, because that's one of the things they look for. Then after that, you could study other factors. I mean, gender, like I said, is really complicated. There's sociological factors, there's cultural factors, there's historical factors that go into gender. Gender roles have been heavily influenced by historical development of different societies, right? In the United States, at one point, women, if you were considered a woman, you couldn't work in a factory, you couldn't vote. Nowadays, we allow people who identify as female to do all those things, right? So gender roles can change over time. So one question you might want to look at for this topic is whether gender is a construction or not, right? Is that a constructed term? Or is there some kind of stable, natural kind of thing that gender can be connected to? Do directly or indirectly? Or is there a biological fact that we can say, well, gender is actually something that is connected to biology, and it's connected to you know, to human embodied human conditions, right, that are beyond our control. So those would be like the extreme positions. That the first extreme position would be that there is no connection between gender and biology. Gender is completely a social construction. So even though I have characteristics of a male, if I decide to identify as female and change my gender, or go transgender, as they say, then you have to address me as she and Mrs. Tassone or Mrs. Doctor or whatever. And then the other extreme would be biological essentialism, that if you're born with two X chromosomes, you're female, and nothing can change that. No matter how much surgery you have, no matter how many hormones you take, how much you alter your appearance, you can never change your given gender, right? Those are the two extremes. And your paper might fall somewhere in the middle, right? But you'll have to take the position. This is where, you know, you will have done the research. After you've done the research, you're going to come to some kind of a thesis, a statement that you're going to defend, some kind of position that you're going to try to convince the judges is a sophisticated, an interesting, maybe a true way to view this question, right? An answer to this question, right? So, you know, it is popular today to separate biology and gender. I don't know how much you want to get into the political reasons or the ethical reasons. I mean, the question doesn't ask about the ethics of gender, but if you believe in gender politics and you really want to defend that position, it would be risky. I would not recommend it, but it is something you can do. You could take that approach that gender essentialism or the connection of gender to biology is oppressive, and you could provide research to show cases where historically it was, and maybe today still is, oppressive, and you could argue for the separation, and you could argue that scientists should separate too, that scientists should not be motivated to apply the categories of gender too strictly or too unflexibly, right? It would be up to you. I mean, again, I do not recommend that, but you can do that. Again, you have to also, when you're writing for the law contest, you have to think about what who the judges are going to be, because the best papers are decided by the judges, right? So the judges are university professors. And I'm guessing university professors, it's hard to tell. If they're philosophy professors, you cannot just assume that they have a particular politics or ethical framework that you can guess. So I would try to not take an extreme position, but again, that is up to you. You could, of course, turn this into a paper on feminism, right? Because feminists have argued that female gender has been oppressed historically. And also remember that, a lot of people are critical today of gender essentialism. So if you're going to take a gender essentialist position, maybe you are a neo-Aristotelian, right? Aristotle's the classic philosopher who believed in gender essentialism. He believed in biological essentialism. And gender essentialism was part of his argument. He actually argued that women are inferior to men, right? So not a feminist's favorite philosopher. But if you're going to take either one of those positions, be careful and try to provide reasons. You can do it, but you have to give good reasons. Gender essentialism, just to be clear, is the belief that gender is a discrete and dichotomous social category. That is one can be either a girl or a boy, male, female, but not both, nor anywhere in between, and that gender is inborn, biologically determined, unchangeable, immutable, and informative of categorical properties. Okay, and if you want to see an argument against gender essentialism, there's a paper online, and I gave the website. It's available. And like I said, I'll post the PowerPoint, or I can send you the PowerPoint if you email me. Okay, so be careful not to, overlook that gender essentialism is very topical, right? If you don't discuss gender essentialism at all, if you just assume gender essentialism, you don't criticize it, you don't even try to argue against it, your paper might not be very successful. The judges might not be moved very, very much by the paper. Okay. All right. So that is the question number one. And, you know, sociological, theoretical critique of gender is popular today. Even if the theory of gender fluidity has political strength, it is asking, I mean, the question is asking about scientists, right? And scientists are empiricists. So scientists want to explore the evidence. And so you can't assume that, you know, gender fluidity, which is the opposite of gender essentialism, is automatically true either, right? Because that would be a rationalist assumption, right? So even if we say there's a separation between gender and biology, you can't just assume that biology has nothing to do with it. So this is, again, this is a tricky topic. By rationalists here, I mean that gender is connected only to concepts or ideas, right? It's completely removed from nature, completely removed from the senses and from the body, right? And in the history of idea, there's always been this tension between empiricists and rationalists. I don't know how deeply you would want to get into this for this topic, but you're going to have to kind of acknowledge it, because discovery, again, epistemology, you're dealing with epistemology, you're going to have to deal with these concepts of rationalist, i.e. knowing things through ideas, versus empiricist, knowing things through senses and through perception and experience. Okay, so those are kind of basic, you know, bedrock concepts in epistemology, and they'll probably come up in your paper. You don't have to go into them in any great detail, but you do have to say how gender is discovered, right? And so you're going to have to somehow touch on those. Yeah. Not the, you know, like I said, it's not the real focus of the question of whether we know gender empirically or rationally, but it's going to be in the background, right? So the debate is probably not going to be solved in a 2,000 word paper, so I wouldn't really worry about it. And also, it's not the real focus of the question, but think about it. You should think about that if you pick this topic, okay? How do we discover gender? And you might want to, you know, look at what we can know about gender empirically versus what we know conceptually or rationally about gender. And biology, you're going to want to do some research in the literature, the biological literature. You know, biology is an empirical science, so you're going to want to look at that. So there's no, you know, really reliable biological knowledge that you can attain only through pure logic or just through the concepts. You can study the linguistic, you know, etymology of male and female. I don't think that's what the question is asking either. But you could make a, you know, you could make a study of how different biological or sociological categories were classified in the past, and how logical definitions can sometimes lead us astray, right? A famous example in the history of philosophy of science is whales as fishes, right? Until the 18th century, a lot of scientists and many people thought that whales were a species of fish, right? Because whales and fish look similar and they both found in the water. And so earlier biologists thought they were related. Well, I mean, we know today that whales are not fish, right? They're superficially similar, but we classify them as different because whales can breathe air. They have live babies, they give live birth, and right, they are warm-blooded. Fish breathe through their gills, they lay eggs, and they're cold-blooded, right? They have scales, kind of related to lizard. Both have things in common. This could be one way to organize the gender question, right? What do we mean by male? What do we mean by female? You can't just assume that we know through the definition of what a male is, what masculinity is. And you can't assume that by defining female in a particular way, we know what femininity is. But there are overlapping categories that biology would be able to discover. And that's one way to look at this question, right? Look at it from the empirical evidence, look at the conceptual evidence we have for designating or categorizing gender in a certain way, and then try to write a paper and take a position that argues that scientists should do X, Y, Z to understand gender, right? Basically, paper dealing kind of with philosophy of science broadly and with epistemology. So question 1 in the philosophy category also seems to be politically sensitive topic. Yeah, a good way to get around that, just to acknowledge the complexity of the concept somewhere in the paper, maybe even in the introduction, to say gender is a very complex topic and is politically charged. Okay, you can insult people by saying that gender just is just related to sex and biology, and that's all, right? So acknowledge that there may not be a clear-cut answer to the question of what gender is that will please everybody. You can say that. And you might even want to point out similarities of the topic of gender to other controversial topics, such as, in philosophy, there's nature versus nurture, right? What qualities are we born with versus what we learn from our environment? The IQ debate is kind of similar, right? There's all kinds of positions on this. Some people think that IQ is determined mostly by genetic inheritance, right? Some people genetically inherit genes that activate their, their brains, they have more efficient brain, and there could be truth to that. Other people think that IQ is developed through education and through environment, right? Gender is kind of similar to those topics. So a good way to tackle this is just acknowledge to the judges that this is a really complex concept. There's no question that will make no answer that will make everybody happy. Scientists who want to study this should take into consideration the fact that this is complex and there are sociological and cultural, cultural elements to the question. But, what can we say about gender? What can scientists discover about gender that is maybe objective or that is classifiable through science, right? That's one way to look at this question. Okay. So that would be the gender question. Let's move on to question number 2. Okay, unless you guys have any comments or questions about the question number 1 about what can scientists discover about gender. Question number 2 is a little bit different. It's more closely connected to psychology rather than biology. Question number 2 asks, in what sense are you the same person today that you were when you were 10 years old? Good question, right? How do you know? What establishes your continuity of selfhood over time? What establishes your identity, right? It's a much more traditionally philosophical question. And especially in modern philosophy, the question of the self, especially after the 17th century, right? It starts with Descartes, really. When Descartes says that I can only know myself clearly and distinctly, right? I know myself cogito ergo sum. I know, therefore I am. I think, therefore I am. And I know myself. I think better than I know the world. That kind of sets a lot of philosophers into examining, well, how do we know ourselves, right? What is this I think Descartes talks about, right? Later thinkers such as Locke actually had a kind of strong emphasis on this question too, because Locke was following a liberal tradition, which in modern politics is a very individualistic framework for understanding society and for understanding human motivation, right? So if you're an individualist, then you have to have some kind of theory about what makes an individual, right? So that makes the question kind of interesting, right? And like I said, it's an epistemological question, but it also involves a few metaphysical categories too, right? Because just because we can identify ourselves as being one person, does that mean that there is a real unity, a kind of essential distinction between me and other people, right? Is the self real or is it a social construction, right? Is it connected to biology in any way, or is it just purely psychological concept? Do I identify as the same person because I have memories of myself when I was 10? Or do I kind of like shape my identity based on what things that are outside of me, right? People who I interact with or social forces that influence me. These are the kinds of topics you'll have to research and think about if you want to answer question number 2 intelligently, right? And it is a complex question, right? In an obvious sense, you could say, well, we are the same person because we remember what we were doing when we were 10, and we remember that, the thoughts that we had when we were younger are have shaped us to act in certain ways, and they influenced our future choices, and they influence our present choices, right? So you could say, well, personal identity, it's kind of just given. It's a given. It's, why would anyone question it? You just know who you are. You know that you're the same person. You know that you exist throughout time, and you can't really question it, right? But I would actually look at this as a question about identity in general, right? And so a good place to start research on the topic of identity would be the articles on identity in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy online, and the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Those are really good sources. And when you look at the identity category, I put the links up if you're interested. When you look at the identity category, scroll down, like read through it, and then scroll down to the bottom of those encyclopedia articles, and you're going to see lengthy bibliographies. And that's actually a good place to start, right? Go through the bibliographies and look for papers about personal identity, influential papers, famous papers. Locke's account, I think it's found in his essay concerning the understanding. Locke has a famous account of how identity is a psychological concept, and we are the same person only because we remember what we were doing before the present. So we remember our past self, and the memory is what links, our previous self-knowledge and concept of self to our present concept of self. And that's the Lockean theory. It's been very popular. So according to Locke's theory, if your memories change, you would be a different person. If someone put fake memories inside your head, or different memories, you would literally be a different person. You would not be yourself, right? And then other people have a more biologically centered concept. They think that the concept of self is formed by the brain, or organized by how your body is shaped, and it's a product of senses in that sense. So it's been described by some philosophers as just kind of self-evident. But other philosophers, like the German philosopher Nietzsche, he thought that the concept of self was a projection of power, right? We identify as selves because it gives us power over our environment. If we have a kind of central focus, a central kind of core identity, then we can actually influence our environment in consistent ways and manipulate our environment better. So other philosophers have said that it's problematic, that there is actually no kind of stable self, but we keep revising and changing our sense of self, and it helps us survive. Basically, it's a survival mechanism. So it's not a basic core truth or a fundamental property, but it's something constructive. Like I said, if we turn to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, they have a really good concept of, or definition of, identity that is a good place to start, right? And this comes from Peter Geach, an American philosopher. He wrote this in 1973. Geach wrote that to say that things are identical is to say that they are the same. Identity and sameness mean the same. Their meanings are identical. However, they have more than one meaning. A distinction is customarily drawn between qualitative and numerical identity or sameness. Things with qualitative identity share properties, so things can be more or less qualitatively identical. Poodles and Great Danes are qualitatively identical because they share the property of being a dog, and such properties as go along with that. But two poodles will, very likely, have greater qualitative identity. Numerical identity requires absolute or total qualitative identity, and can only hold between a thing and itself. Its name implies the controversial view that it is the only identity relation in accordance with which we can properly count or number things. X and Y are to be properly counted as just one in case they are numerically identical. So there's Peter Geach on identity. And actually, that's an interesting definition of identity, because it helps us look at the question from a new perspective, right? So one way we could look at question number 2 in the Locke essay contest is to say, how are we numerically identical, right? Because the question is asking, how are we the same person, not how are we different people that are connected together into an illusion of self, right? It's asking, how are we the same? How are we numerically identical? So what is it that underlies our unique personhood such that our memories, our values, our beliefs, our experiences belong to one identity or one subject, right? That's really what the question is asking. And again, since the time of John Locke, it's been accepted that the subject of experience, might have qualities that are different from just having a unified physical body, right? Locke was the one who said, well, he was following Descartes. He said that basically our memories are what make us individual people, right? And so mental activities like memories are connected to the brain, of course, but we still don't know exactly how the sense of self comes out of the brain. And no one would say that they are who they are simply because they have a physical brain, right? Because every other human being has a similar physical brain. So the sense of self that you have, the sense of personhood, seems to go just beyond the brain. We don't identify really directly with our brains. And proof of that is that when you see an X-ray of your brain, it's very strange looking to you. You don't say, that's me. Right? But when you see yourself in a mirror, you do say, that's me, right? We identify indirectly with our physical body, it seems. And of course, there are psychological phenomena such as body dysmorphia, right? Where people don't even identify with their bodies. And this, indirectly connecting back to the gender question, when you are misgendered, that seems to be a false sense of self, right? Because if you're born a male but you identify as female, then you've been misgendered. How does that happen, right? It happens because your sense of self, your personal sense of self, and how the world sees you are separate, right? They're different. So, yeah, an interesting question. Again, this is mostly epistemology we're dealing with. So it's the study of how we know. How do we know we are a self, right? That's what it's asking. How we know we are numerically identical self, okay, and not many, self or many personalities. So there are really two opposing ways to deal with the problem, right? And you're going to have to do research on this if you really want to answer this question and provide the judges with a kind of impression that you've thought about the question deeply and that you have a depth of knowledge about this question. You want to look at mind-brain identity theory, which is also known as reductionism, and phenomenological or epistemological theories about the self, also known as contingency theories. Contingency theory would say that there is some kind of basic separation between our psychological or internal sense of personhood or self and our bodies and the external world. And reductionist theories would say that the self is a projection of the body. The self is really just the brain organizing inputs and giving us a centralized core identity so that we can adapt to the environment. So those are really the two basic positions. So mental states, subjective psychological experience, according to reductionists, is really just physical brain states, physical processes. So what makes us a self is that our neurons form kind of connections, and then they are united physically by the brain. And because we physically and numerically have one physical body, that some kind of output from that physical body is giving us our sense of self. And so that could, evidence for that position could be that you could have a continuous sense of yourself from the time you were 10 years old until the present day. But that sense of self could change radically if you get brain damage, right? Because if you get brain damage, you could, completely change, or you could perceive yourself in a completely different way, right? But epistemological theories would argue that even if you get brain damage, what's changing here is that psychological states that you're forming are now different. And so you're losing the purely mental sense of the self that you had before, right? And so epistemological theories would argue that even if we know how the brain is functioning or shooting off neurons, even if we know all the information connected to our brain states, if we have an MRI scan, if we have a neural map of our brain activity from minute to minute, you can't extract the sense of self from that data. There's something more that's missing, even when you completely and exhaustively examine your physical brain and your body, right? So depending on which position you think is true, you're going to be arguing one way or the other that the sense of self is somehow, connected directly to our physical body, the mind and the brain are one thing, and that it's connected to the body. Or you're going to argue that it's contingent and the sense of self develops separately over the body. So how you would do that is probably by reading earlier important papers on the topic and seeing the strength of their arguments, right? The arguments pro and contra. And so the epistemological theory, or the phenomenological theory, as they call the contingency theory, is going to give credence to this kind of first-person perspective, that the sense of self is immediate, that the sense of self is not reducible to anything third person that can be described in a third person objective way, right? But mind-brain identity theory, or reductionism, is going to say that that personal experience is an illusion, okay? And the sense of self is a kind of helpful illusion in that sense too. Okay. So the problem with focusing only on reductionism is that, this empirical data that we learn about has to be interpreted by a subject, right? A person, and that person has a sense of continuity, right? Because we exist as people in time. Right? So how do we get access to these personal states, right? Is it purely biological, or is there something more? And if we know our experience better than we know our brain states and our neurons and our, physical properties of our bodies and heads, then how can you account for this immediate connection of, your sense of yourself and this immediate, acquaintance with experience that you have, that never goes away. It's with you constantly, right? Even when you fall asleep, you still kind of dream, and you can remember sometimes your dreams, which have been given only to you, right? No one else has had those or seen those, right? So yeah, an interesting question. Again, it goes back really to Descartes. And one way to look at this is the problem of dualism, right? Is the self different from the body? It's the self something over and above the body. And Descartes was the founder of this kind of radical dualism. He said that the mind and the self are different from the body, right? In fact, he said that the self, or the I think, is a completely different substance. He called it a thinking substance. And he said that we know it because it's our nature to think, while bodies have the property of extension and they cannot think, right? So our bodies don't think at all. Our bodies don't know that they are individual and that they are unique, but our minds do, right? And then Locke argued that we do know the contents of our minds, but because we have experience through the body, right? This is Locke's essay concerning human understanding. Locke wrote, "We have an intuitive knowledge of our own existence and an internal infallible perception that we are. In every act of sensation, reasoning, or thinking, we are conscious to ourselves of our own being." So that could be a good place to start, right? This could be called the classical source of, in philosophy, in Western philosophy, of the self as a unity, right? Simplicity, a simple unity, a numerically identical thing. It goes back to this kind of modern tradition, right? But later on in Western philosophy, there were critics of this. The German philosopher Immanuel Kant said that we actually don't have any direct knowledge of our true selves, right? We interpret data given to us from outside, both outside and inside of our consciousness. Kant called this the synthesis of the manifold, right? He called this the unity of apperception. And he said that we have certain categories that we impose onto the world. And these categories of the understanding allow us to make sense of what he called phenomenal reality, okay, or the construction of experience. But the true things in themselves are invisible for us. And that includes us as numerically identical selves. Kant said, we have no idea of the noumenal self. We don't know what we are. We only interpret given experiences and given thoughts through these unchanging categories. And we can only know the knowledge that we gain through applying these categories, right? That was the Kantian view. So a good place to start for this question would be, if you say that you're the same person today as you were 10 years ago, how do you know yourself, right? And can you have false or incomplete memories of yourself 10 years ago? Most people would say yes. Most people would argue that memory is fallible. You can have a sense of yourself that is not complete, or that is a distortion, and you may actually be constructing a sense of self day to day rather than have some kind of continuous experiencing center that is perfectly connected to the experiencing self that you were 10 years ago, right? It's an interesting question. Again, mainly epistemological, a little bit of metaphysics involved, right? Because we're dealing with what individuates something. How are you the same being? Right? How are you the same being that you were 10 years ago? And most people would say there has to be some kind of connection between yourself today and yourself 10 years ago. What that connection is basically what the question is asking. So can you be mistaken? This is one way to approach this question. Maybe you might want to start not by saying, I don't know what I was 10 years ago. You would say, well, when I think about myself 10 years ago, I remember a lot of things. I remember what I wanted to do. I remember what I was doing in my life. I remember who my friends were. I remember what I thought I was going to do or be. But a good way to start would be, can we be mistaken about our identity or even our own desires, right? Can we be mistaken about not only who we are, but uh, you know, but basically what we want, why we do the things we do, and why we want to seek certain actions or make certain choices, right? If you follow Locke, you can just start with psychology, right? So this could be this question. I mean, it is a philosophy question still, but you could answer the question by looking at the Lockean definition and say, okay, we have this inner perception of our own experience, but how reliable is that, right? How do we know that that experience is giving us accurate data? It's giving us accurate information, right? Especially because in 20th century, you get the birth of depth psychology, right? This goes back to the Austrian thinker Sigmund Freud. And Freud argued that we have an unconscious as well as a conscious mind, right? So one way to look at this would be, how does our unconscious shape our identity, right? When we say, I am the same person as I was 10 years ago, we're using our superficial conscious memories to make this deduction, right? We're just saying, oh, I remember what I was doing 10 years ago, so I'm exactly the same person. But what if our unconscious desires are actually shaping our identity, and we have limits to what we can actually know about, ourselves? This changes the kind of complex. It makes the question a little bit more complex, and it changes the kind of tone of the question. And also, on a Freudian view, a lot of experiences are actually below the level of consciousness, but the unconscious is what shapes the rational, appearing conscious self, right? So an interesting question, right? So one way to deal with the second question might be to just ask, why do we need a sense of self? What role does the sense of self serve in helping us survive? Does it help us thrive and live, or does it actually make our lives painful, right? Maybe we should forget about ourselves once in a while, right? We should have experiences where we put that out of focus, where we can just lose ourselves in objective activity, right? Okay, so I mean, question two is interesting. Question one, again, was the gender question. A lot of interesting ways you could approach that. You'd have to look at empirical science, you'd have to look at sociology, and maybe even anthropology. Question two, you're looking at epistemology again, but you want to look more at psychology, maybe even depth psychology, and you want to look at the history of philosophy too, and how different philosophers have used the concept of self as a kind of basis for grounding knowledge about both the world and ourselves, right? And so let's move on to the last question in this year's contest. And the last question is about taxation. Yeah, final question in the philosophy category. It's basically a question in political philosophy, right? I don't know why they didn't. I mean, they could have put this in economics too, right? It's kind of overlaps. It overlaps basically with political philosophy and economics. Is tax theft? Okay, does the collection of taxes involve theft? Interesting question. So I don't know. My impression is that very, very few people would answer this question in positive. Very few people would say, yes, we should never have taxes ever. But some might, right? If you are an anarcho-libertarian, like an anarchist capitalist, maybe you don't believe in the legitimacy of government. That's what an anarchist is. You might say that taxes support the government, and so taxes are immoral, right? That they are a kind of theft, and that they oppress people. But that's a very extreme position because most people believe that human societies need governance, right? And need governments in order to function and in order to help people flourish. If you're going to have a political community, which, you know, human beings seem to be political animals, right? If you're going to have a political community, you need some kind of government. So how is the government going to support itself, right? Or how is it going to be funded? And taxation is the best way to answer that question. So, I mean, this is again a different question because it's dealing more with ethics than the first two questions dealt with epistemology and a little bit with metaphysics. This is dealing with ethics, right? So how, if is taxation theft, and if it's not, how do you justify it? Like, what is it, and what is its legitimate role? An interesting question, right? So you're going to want to look at political philosophy a little bit here, and you're going to want to look at also maybe even a little bit at economics, right? Because taxation deals with income and it deals with wealth, right? The distribution of wealth, even. Okay, so it has strong ethical implications, right? If they're saying, if you argue that theft, that taxation is theft, well, theft is basically the taking of something by force, right? Something, to take something illegitimately is to steal it, right? It's almost always illegal. And if, you know, if traditional understandings of theft are being used, then this would make taxation immoral. Right? Because if something is yours by law, then it's your property. And taxation is usually considered as something that we do voluntarily, although it is true that, especially in the United States, if you don't pay your taxes, you will be arrested or you will have your actual property taken from you, right? You can have your salary garnished, you can have your wages garnished if you don't pay taxes, you can even have your private property taken away if you don't pay your taxes. You can go to jail, in fact, right? So, but most people still just think that it's right to pay taxes. They think that it's just, that it's a good thing. Even though, again, many people will say that they don't pay taxes because they feel like it, right? They pay taxes because it's expected and it is right and it is what they should do because they get benefits too from those taxes. So in political philosophy, especially in modern political philosophy, there's something called social contract theory, right? And so if you want to defend taxation, you could probably use that framework to say, well, according to the social contract, if you're a part of a community, then you have both, you have duties that you have to fulfill to remain a legitimate or, lawful member of that community, and you will receive benefits when you fulfill those duties. So one of your duties is to pay taxes. One of the benefits from that is that you get things like streets and firefighters and police officers. You get all kinds of social services and public goods. You get a park, you get to go to a park, you get all of these things, museums, a lot of these are funded by tax money, right? Schools, public schools in the United States, are funded through taxation, right? Private schools are, funded by students and by taxes, so it's a little bit more complex. But yeah, taxes do a lot, especially in a modern society. So if you want to live in a modern society that has public goods and plentiful services and things like infrastructure, then you are required to pay a portion of your salary to the government so that those goods and services can be funded. And that's the argument for taxation, right? But that's not really, that's one argument for taxation, the social contract argument, that you kind of have made a contract, you kind of participating in society, so you've implicitly made a contract with everyone else that you're going to support that society, right? But, some people would argue that social contract theory is complex because, we don't decide what society we're born into. And also, nobody really signs an actual contract when they participate or live in a given society, right? Okay. So you can see the ethical dimension here. Okay, so the majority of people would say that, yeah, we should all pay taxes. We have a legal obligation to pay taxes. And that could be the pro argument. There's probably better ways to defend it too. There's ethical categories you could invoke, and we'll look at that in a little while. But the pro argument is that paying taxes is necessary to support the functioning of society. And so taxation is not theft. Most societies implement fines or imprisonment to those who don't want to pay their taxes, but they are justified in doing that because those people are breaking the social contract, right? But even if you support the payment of taxes, you can still disagree. This is where the question becomes a bit more interesting. Let's say you say taxation is not theft. Society has a right to demand part of your salary because you are receiving benefits. So even if you support that, you can still say that the payment of taxes is sometimes misused. That's fair, right? So you could actually look at this question as not only is taxation theft or is taxation legitimate, but you could look at it as what forms of taxation are legitimate and how much, money is the government or state, morally permitted to take from you, right? Because if you put this from a philosophical perspective, from an ethical perspective, even if you agree the government has a right to take a part of your property or your salary, as a kind of taxation, as a kind of a payment that you must make in order to participate in society, most people would agree that the government does not have a right to take all of your salary, right? The government does not have a right to rob you of all of your possessions. In other words, to make you a slave. That is something that everyone would say is immoral, right? So again, it's a question of morality here. So even if you agree with taxes, is there a limit, right? Can the government take half of your salaries, or is that too much? And if it is, why? Why is it too much? It shouldn't be up to the government, like how much taxes they take from you, or do you have a say, right? In most democratic societies, people actually have a voice because you can elect representatives who will argue that taxes are too high or too low, and they will change the tax, the kind of tax rate. And that's a separate question from the legality or illegality of taxation, right? You could say taxes are legal. I don't think taxation is theft, but in some cases, taxes are, misused or misspent, or the tax revenue is used for causes I don't believe in, right? And that's a kind of interesting point. So you could say, although taxation is not theft, there are cases where the government misuses tax revenue, and this paper will argue, I will show that taxes must be minimal. Minimal taxation is ethical, but too much taxation is bad. So that's one way you could answer question number 3 for the Locke content. Would be a bit more nuanced, right? Because obviously a simple yes/no answer, it's going to be not as interesting, right? But even if you do say taxes are always fine, you have to give reasons for why, right? and you have to show why. So what about the opposite position? What if you wanted to be a contrarian? What if you wanted to argue against common wisdom? If you wanted to argue that taxation is theft, could you do that? How could anyone argue, right, against the payment of taxes? It would make this, that would be an interesting topic, right? Maybe you might win the prize if you argue against collecting taxes, if you do it really well and if you provide a really, really good argument. Well, the good news is that there are philosophers and political theorists and social thinkers who have argued against the payment of taxes, right? Most of those thinkers supported free market. They supported individualism over collectivism. So they were critical of the state, right? They were critics of the state. They thought that government, a large government, was immoral. You know, some of them were capitalists. If you're a pure capitalist, and if you think that private property is of central importance to human life and to the quality of human life, then you could argue that every individual has a right to their own property, right? And actually, this is similar to John Locke's argument, since this is the Locke contest. It never hurts to quote Locke. This is similar to Locke's argument in his second treatise of civil government from 1689, because there Locke argued that all government authority has to arrive from the consent of the people being governed, right? That any government that does not have the consent of the people is illegitimate according to Locke. It's immoral. So the role of government for Locke is not to establish rights or even to tell people what to do or how to live. The only role of government, the legitimate ethical role of government, is to protect private property, right? Because Locke says that in a state of nature, we have all of our rights are given to us both by nature and by God, right? So we don't need government to give us rights. We don't need government to tell us what is right and wrong. What we need is government to protect private property. But if you take this Lockean position, right, this would be a very classical liberal position. If you take that position, and Locke was arguing this position basically because he was against the divine right of kings, right? Because in Europe at the time, there were very, very few democratic governments. And so Locke was arguing in favor of this new classical vision of government, right? In that sense, he would go on to influence the founding fathers in the United States, right? They cite Locke in the Declaration of Independence. They kind of echo Locke in all those early writings, the Federalist Papers, the Declaration of Independence. They really are strongly influenced by Locke. So if all the governed citizens in a given state have a voice, right, and if they vote to eliminate taxation, would that be acceptable, right? And it seems that it would. Like if you have a community where the entire community is against taxation, then wouldn't it be immoral for someone to take over that community and force them to pay heavy taxes, even though they have agreed by voting and through consent that they want no taxation, right? And it seems that it would. So that's an argument against taxation as legitimate, right? In this particular instance. And actually, this is not something I thought of originally. This was actually an argument offered by the French political philosopher Frédéric Bastiat in 1850. He wrote a book called The Law, and he was not extreme. He believed in moderate taxation, right? There were other political thinkers who thought all taxation was theft. Proudhon, I think, thought that, and Jean-Baptiste Say. There's a couple of thinkers who actually argued against. You can look them up. If you choose to write on this topic, it would be good to mention these thinkers, right? Because you don't want to, even if you take the position that taxation is valid, taxation is a good thing, taxation is something that helps communities, you still want to represent the opposite position, right? But Bastiat in 1850, he wrote a book called The Law. And in that book, he wrote, I'll quote Bastiat, and you can find it. There's copies of this online. It's out of copyright, so you can just download it and read it. Legal plunder. Now, legal plunder may be exercised in an infinite multitude of ways. Hence come an infinite multitude of plans for organization, tariffs, protection, prerequisites, gratuities, encouragements, progressive taxation, free public education, right to work, right to profit, right to wages, right to assistance, right to instruments of labor, gratuity of credit, et cetera, et cetera. And it is all these plans taken as a whole with what they have in common, legal plunder, that takes the name of socialism. So what Bastiat was arguing was that taxation or heavy taxation and government programs that influence the lives of people are forms of socialism. He thought that socialism was immoral, and he argued, therefore, that taxation was equivalent to legal plunder, legalized theft, right? And so that's the contraposition right there. Even though he believed in that the government could collect some taxes, but Bastiat was saying that any form of taxation that is, extensive is a form of socialism. And he considered himself an economist primarily, and he was arguing in the laws, he was arguing partly from an economic position, an economic framework. But today he's read basically as a social thinker. Yeah, and from Bastiat's perspective, limited taxation can be used by the state, but once taxes become forced to pay for services that are not necessary, then Bastiat says taxation becomes legal plunder, which is synonymous with theft, right? So it is theft in those cases, right? And so taxes levied for purposes beyond the very, very limited role that government should have for necessary services, fire department, police force, roads, building roads, and maybe electricity, electrical grids, the army, I guess he would allow. Anything beyond that, theft, right? So very, 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 very limited taxation is what Bastiat wanted, like minimal taxation, right? The problem with Bastiat's position is who determines what is necessary, right? Who determines that public universal education, public education is not necessary? Bastiat did not believe in that, but a lot of people think that it is necessary, right? Not only to educate a population, but also to socialize children. Although in America, a lot of families do homeschool, but but the question here is an ethical question, right? What is necessary, and how do we determine that something is necessary, right? Because strictly speaking, a lot of things that we think are necessary are not necessary. I mean, we know that. It's not necessary that you have a smartphone. You could survive. You could survive without a phone, and you could flourish as a person with a smartphone. But a lot of people today think it's a necessity in modern society to have, some kind of smartphone or a computer, even, or access to the internet. Right? Are those necessary? Well, the internet didn't exist, 60 years ago. So, right? So 60 years ago, it wasn't necessary. But today, some people argue this. So this is a difficult, because the criteria for what is necessary changes. But when we're dealing with taxation, I mean, basically taxation affects the people. And so when you ask what is necessary for a society, usually the people decide, right? And the people generally want, I mean, in my experience, people generally want as many services as it's possible to have in order to improve quality of life, right? So if something new comes along, something that makes people's lives easier or of higher quality, they want it, right? They say it's necessary. Okay, but by contrast, the argument for paying taxes is usually that we have a duty, right? Sometimes called fair play, to contribute to all the services that we benefit from, or the services that society as a whole provides to keep, the quality of life of a certain standard, right? So, in opposite to Bastiat, the American philosopher Brooks Brown argued that we have a moral obligation to pay taxes. And her argument was kind of interesting. You can find it here. I link up, but I'm just going to read a summary of it, her thesis. She says that the best argument for paying our taxes is intellectual humility, right? And here is what it means. Here's what that means. Satisfying the duties of reciprocity requires successfully compensating our fellow citizens for all the burdens they took on our behalf, right? So basically, in order for society to function, everyone has duties that they have to fulfill. Everyone has a role to play, so that you, for example, as an individual, can participate in an actually functioning society, right? If you want to travel overseas, you rely on the goodwill of, the airplane pilot and the airport workers and, roads to take you to the airport. And all of that improves the quality of your life and helps you achieve your goals. And those things are things that, have to be sustained and have to be compensated for. So someone has to be paid to build those roads. Someone has to be paid to work in the airport, right? So as one can imagine, it is a hard calculation to make. It is difficult to know if we have done enough. If we choose not to pay taxes because we think we have already repaid our fellow citizens in other ways, we run a strong risk of getting it wrong. So paying the tax bill is one way of avoiding that risk and making sure we treat our fellow citizens fairly. And this is an interesting paper, and you might want to look at it if you want to answer this question for the Locke contest, because it is, a kind of ethical argument that taxation is not theft and taxation is morally required, right? And again, that can be contrasted with Bastiat's, notion of, as he put it, legal plunder, that anything beyond what is necessary is illegitimate and is theft, right? It is basically not ethically viable. So that's the third question in the Locke contest, and that's pretty much ends the philosophy category. So if you want to write on those three questions, you'll have to start by doing some background research, collect some sources, go to the Encyclopedia of Philosophy, the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy online. Those are really good peer-reviewed sources. Do not go to Wikipedia. Anyone can edit that, and usually, Wikipedia has reliable, information, but sometimes biased or unreliable information. So try to go to peer-reviewed sources. Look at the bibliography of the articles if you want to write on philosophy of gender or how scientists discover how many genders there are. You might want to look also at philosophy of biology. You might want to look at, theories about gender, and collect some some important sources and read those over and kind of understand, the people. Oh, I've got some, okay, so we've got some chat message. Can you go back to the page that starts with the people? You got it. Like I said, if you want this PowerPoint, email me. I'll send you the PowerPoint. I can write my email in the chat. So that's my email. Just email me and I can send you the PowerPoint. It's got some links in it too, and it's kind of useful. So yeah. So the last thing I wanted to do tonight, though, just to wrap up here, I wanted to show you guys successful examples of Locke papers from the past, some winning articles from the Locke contest. Here's let's see. Can you guys see this? So this is the winning philosophy paper from 2019. And this was the first prize paper. I think it won the overall contest. It was by Young-Hoon Seo from South Korea. And the paper was Aristotelian virtue ethics achieved something of a resurgence in 20th century. This was the question the Locke contest posted. Was this progress or retrogression? And you can see that they started out addressing the question directly and defining the terms. So progress and retrogression in philosophy, right? So the question asks about Aristotle's ethics and the 20th century resurgence of Aristotelian ethics. This writer started by looking at the second half of the question. Was it progress or retrogression? Was it progress or was it not progress? And this is a great way to start. You're defining terms, right? Progress and retrogression in philosophy, right? And the writer tells us, well, in the physical world, time measures progress and retrogression as steps along this linear timeline based on the empirical evidentiary fact, right? These facts are verified or falsified as time passes, which inextricably links time to and progress. For example, replacing heliocentrism with geocentrism is retrogressive because the astronomical evidence accumulated through time discredits the latter. However, progress in philosophy is incompatible with such a view because philosophy belongs to the abstract world where the lack of empirical factual basis obfuscates the link between time and progress. This is great. This is a wonderful way to start because you're defining your terms and then just going to say, so, how do we know if in ethics, a particular framework that was from, earlier times is better or worse than a framework that was discovered last year or last month? And the thesis of the paper is to answer the question, we need to construct a method that measures progress in philosophy. And the writer then says, I seek to achieve this by asserting that in philosophy, a certain degree of falsification is achievable. Okay, and then they quote Karl Popper's theory of progress. And they say progress occurs when, and they give two criteria, and then they go on to say first condition, right? Overcoming social and moral concern. And so effectively they build on the argument. They give a lot of sources and footnotes. You see, this is 8, 9. I'll show you actually how they cite the footnotes. They give their conditions. This is a very well ordered paper. It is a very clear paper. It is clearly written. It gives good logical arguments for the conclusions it arrives at. This is like all around a good philosophy paper, and it ends concluding, re-summarizing. What's the conclusion? Aristotelian virtue ethics successfully fulfills the two established conditions of progress. Although virtue ethics belong to an era 2,000 years back in time, its resurgence in the 20th century was a step forward in normative ethics. So this is really a good example, right? Consult if you're going to be writing a philosophy paper for the Locke contest, because this paper won the prize, right? So it's a good model to look at. And then this is like the the detail that they went into. These are the footnotes, right? 17 footnotes for basically what is a 5-page paper. Well researched, right? Author's note, right? Talking about what, how they had to limit the focus of the paper because of the length restriction. And then look at the bibliography. Major sources here, you've got Aristotle, Anscombe. She's a leading figure in virtue ethics. Jeremy Bentham, British classical utilitarian thinker. Sarah Brodie, who's a Aristotle scholar. So if the judges were to look at this, they would say this person has a real depth, a real good background knowledge of Aristotelian virtue ethics, because they're citing not only primary sources, but secondary sources, right? And then you've got Kant, classic German philosopher, and you've got, Michael Stoker, again, an ethical thinker, ethical philosopher, Michael Sandel, another ethical philosopher. And so that's one example, right? I'll show you one more example of a successful philosophy paper for the Locke contest. Here it is. This was the 2020. This won the philosophy category, but I don't think this one did not win overall, but it won the philosophy category. Can you see my screen? Oh wait, that's my other one, right? Hold on a minute. Can you guys see the? Hold on a second. I think I lost it. What? I'll share the screen. There it is. Okay. There we go. Okay. Can you see that? So is intuition to philosophy as observation is to science? And this was by Ethan Christian Tan from the Anglo-Chinese School in Singapore. And it did win the grand prize too. So this won the 2020 grand prize. And again, you can see the format. Science and philosophy share the fundamental goal of knowledge production. Former explains and predicts the material universe. Latter seeks to answer questions within the field of logic, epistemology, metaphysics, and axiology, okay, or ethics. This common objective will contextualize my discussion of observation and intuition as the means to the end of producing scientific and philosophical knowledge. So he starts by defining, his terms, and by saying what, philosophy does and why intuition is central to philosophy, right? And then he further defines his terms. He talks about observation and intuition. He says they can both be thought of as independent sources of knowledge. Okay, and goes on to break down, the problems that he's looking at, very well organized. Again, the paper is divided into different sections. Each section deals with an important topic that builds on what was said earlier and helps develop his argument. He goes on to talk about the roles that observation and intuition play in scientific and philosophical knowledge. Then he goes on to talk about how reliable these processes are, intuition and observation, how do they fulfill the role. And then he goes on to talk about how they occupy these roles, and he concludes the paper and he gives a summary, re-emphasizes of the three bases of comparison: role, reliability, exclusivity. Intuition and observation are similar on all counts, with the exception that intuition, unlike observation, does not play a deductive role in philosophy. Thus, I conclude that less the aforementioned difference intuition is to philosophy as observation is to science. And again, you get your footnotes, this time very extensively cited sources here, 46 footnotes for what is basically a 5-page paper. That's exhaustive, right? So you see the judges of the Locke contest take that into consideration, how deeply you've researched. The bibliography, again, extensive bibliography. He's looked at online sources and cited those. But I mean, you've got basically a 2-page bibliography for what is basically a 5-page paper, right? So that's the kind of format. This is the kind of outline the paper should have. Again, the length of the paper should be 2,000 words, and it should be well researched, and it should be very well organized, and you should provide citations and footnotes and a bibliography. So, okay. Well, I think that's it. Kind of overview of this year's philosophy category and examples of how you should write the papers, or how you should organize the papers anyway. And these previous winning papers can also be found on the Locke contest website, so you can go look them up. They have papers and many more papers. I copied these ones and to show you because they are philosophy papers. Right. So that about does it. Unless you guys have any questions, I'd be happy to answer any questions. I've helped students write for the Locke contest before. One of my students got a runner-up, but nobody's ever won. But you never know. Maybe in the future. May I please send my email? Oh, I posted my email in the chat, but I can type it again. I mean, it's already in the chat. But it's blazetasone@gmail.com. It is in the chat. So you can, if you want my PowerPoint or anything like that, or if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. You can reach me by email. Okay. You're welcome. So any other questions or comments, or so if you're interested in the philosophy section, I think you should start by checking out some primary sources that address the questions that the Locke people have posted. So you'd want to look at philosophy of biology, political philosophy, taxation, and theories of self. There's tons of writing available in all three of those categories. So they're all really complex categories. So you can definitely find a lot of information. Your job is going to be, the challenge is going to be finding good sources that are relevant and then taking only a few of them, because I think what's going to happen is you're going to find a lot of different sources, and you want the most reliable, right? You want the best. Usually that means the best known sources, but also sources that have survived the test of time, right? Usually the classic works in philosophy have survived the test of time. You can't go wrong by looking at thinkers like Plato, Aristotle, Descartes, Kant, and Locke, right? Because those thinkers have been read for centuries, and people keep writing about them and reading them. So that shows a kind of acquaintance also with the tradition, and so that's important in philosophy. Okay, so yeah, that's about it. So thank you for showing up. I hope I was useful. I hope what I said was helpful for some people.
Thank you so much. This is a very informative and a very
Okay.
solid.
All right, Caroline, thank you. Thanks for managing this.
Thank you.
Okay, have a great night.
You too.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.